Hi, my name is Steven and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking to you about how to push through failure, a guide to pushing through the mental hardships of failure. So failure is really tough to bounce back from. Even small failures might affect you. But pushing through failure and then growing afterwards is a key skill that everyone can learn. No one goes through life with constant successes. Sooner or later, you go through a failure. And not just one. Many people go through many failures throughout their lives. And then at some point, we have to mentally deal with the failure. And then we choose to either ignore it and push on, or get defeated by it. Throughout my own personal life, I've had to deal with multiple failures, and it really tested me. I had to find the mental strength to push through and continue onward. And sometimes that was really difficult depending on the size of the failure. So I had to rely on a few tips and tricks that I've learned throughout my experience of failure to get me through the day. So hopefully this video, which is a compilation of my tips and strategies I've learned from failure, can help you as well. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about my failures, how it impacted my life, and tips on overcoming the mental barriers of failures. So before we start, please share to like, subscribe, comment, share with your friends if you found this content to be useful. And let's go! So pushing through failure and growing from it can be pretty difficult. It requires a lot of self-reflection and the belief that you'll do better next time. I've had some failures in my life that really forced me to reevaluate what I was doing in my life. And ultimately that made me a better person. Because at the end of the day, I really learned from that experience and it pushed me to motivate myself to move on from it. So here are some of my failures that ultimately helped me to become a better person. Number 1, graduating college without a plan. After spending 4 years in engineering school and graduating with a bachelor's degree, I didn't have a plan going forward. I graduated in 2009 at the height of the Great Recession, and opportunities during that time were very limited. But despite this, I really felt like I was a failure because I wasn't able to do anything beyond graduating. I wasn't able to line up a job or have anything going forward. And for the first time in my life, I had no plan. Graduating college and finding a job was the plan, and I utterly failed at finding a job after school. There was no exact single reason that led me to this failure, but as a whole, I still felt utter defeat and shame. And I was really worried that this would be with me for a long time because during the Great Recession, I didn't have a lot of options. And I really struggled to find out what my next steps were. But I had to do something to pick myself back up. I started reaching out to schools in the area for anything that they need help with. I contacted engineering labs, science labs if they needed a volunteer. And throughout the Los Angeles area, I was able to get in contact with a professor at Caltech. He was looking for a particular person to help out with the lab. And me volunteering was just icing on the cake because he didn't have to expend resources on me. After a while, I proved my worth and I was able to get a paid position. But it wasn't an easy process. I had to really pick myself back up, regain some of that confidence I lost after I graduated. And over a period of months and weeks did I have to really work hard to gain his trust so that he can offer me a job. I really grew from this in a massive way. For the first time in my life, I took control of my own destiny. No longer was there a prescribed path for me to do. Everything I did up to graduation was predestined based on societal expectations. After graduating without a job, I really felt that I needed to take control of my own life. I had high expectations of myself, and I really wanted myself to do well. But that really wasn't the case because I had to take in external considerations and also my abilities at the time. I had to realize that it wasn't my failure necessarily that I didn't have a job. It was only my choice if I chose to stay unemployed. Because there was a lot of opportunities that didn't require an engineering degree, and I had to find those opportunities and slowly build from that. So number 2, moving out of San Francisco. I quit the city of San Francisco because I just couldn't hack it. It was too tough for me to live there. After 3 years in San Francisco, I just couldn't realistically convince myself that I was right for that city. I really couldn't compete with the high cost of living and the stress and anxiety that others had on me. I really never did find my footing there, either with my job or my friend network. And the dating scene there was pretty horrible. Going to San Francisco from Los Angeles, I thought it would give me a fresh start. And for a while it did. But as time grew, the city with all its affluence and tech workers really intimidated me because I was starting from the bottom and I didn't have any of that stuff. And so I was always talking to people that were richer, well off, or more educated than I was. It really hit my ego that I wasn't up to their level and I wasn't going to be for a long time. So really when I left the city, I felt defeated and like a failure. Ultimately, when I moved to Seattle from San Francisco, I took the lessons learned from those first few years in San Francisco. I was much more proactive about building a strong friends network in the area, and I was also more proactive in getting engaged with my job early on, and making sure that I did not repeat the same mistakes I had in San Francisco. So it really forced me to be proactive about my situation and not let it just kind of passively come to me. Number 3, failure to be authentic in my 20s. My 20s were hard, especially early on. I didn't know who I was or what I stood for, and this led me down different paths that I didn't really like about myself. I was swayed by different people and situations that, now looking back on it, I very much cringe. I was really doing things to impress other people rather than doing it for myself, and I really suffered because I was being so inauthentic to myself. I caused drama, I talked badly about other people, and I did things that I wasn't proud of to impress people during that time. And so this failure to be authentic really started to shift and change for me when I left San Francisco. I realized that I caused a lot of issues unnecessarily, and really, I started to see Seattle as a new beginning. I had a chance to have a new start, and I wanted to be better than what I was. It's interesting because as soon as I started to take myself seriously and form my own code of conduct, things really started to improve in my life in many small ways. I was able to make deeper connections with people, take more risks, and also be happier in general as a result. So those are some of my failures and how I was able to learn and grow from them. In many cases, they impacted my life in a very significant way, and I had to really dig deep into self-reflection. Because after that failure, I really needed to analyze and figure out why I failed in the first place. And taking that time and space allowed me to come up with an answer and move on from it, and ultimately grow into a better individual. So now let's talk about some of my tips on overcoming failure. Number 1, everything is temporary. Feeling failure in the moment can be one of the worst feelings in the world. There's no escaping it. You're gonna feel bad after a failure. If not directly after, sometime thereafter. At some point, you'll feel the full effects of that failure. But keep in mind that it will eventually go away. Time heals all wounds, and the sting of the failure will heal or slowly dissipate over time. Having the mindset that the feeling of failure will go away will help you in the long run. And it also gets you in the mindset of preparing for what's next. Because at the end of the day, you want the feeling of failure to go away. You don't want it to stick around forever. If you keep repeating the same thoughts over and over, you're gonna drive yourself crazy. So keep in mind when you're going through a failure that it's gonna be painful in the beginning, but it's not gonna last over a long period of time. You are gonna get over it eventually. And that kind of mindset will help you prepare for the future, for what comes after the failure, which can be growth. Number 2, life isn't fair, so don't believe it is. It often does need to be repeated, but life isn't fair. It just isn't. We get complacent sometimes when nothing goes wrong in our lives for a very long time. And so we think that nothing bad can happen to us. And that mindset blinds us to the fact that a failure or something bad can happen at any moment in time. The expectation that life is fair does a massive disservice to us when we go through a failure and are trying to move on from it. Because at the core of it, we want to believe that life is fair and that failure cannot happen to us, that it happens to other people, less deserving people. And believing that life is fair will build up resistance to you accepting the failure, your responsibility for it, and moving on from it in the future. So come with a mindset that good things can happen to you, bad things can happen to you. Life is random. Accept that. This tip of mine has really helped me to keep in perspective of my own failures. When failure happens to me, I also try to remember that massive success has happened to me as well. There's an equivalent success for every failure that I have. And that success might have also come from the fact that life isn't fair for someone else. So keep in perspective whenever failure arrives that life isn't fair and you're just receiving the bad end of randomness. Someday you'll have a good end of randomness as well. So number 3, growth happens after failure. Personal growth, and growth in general, rarely happens after successes. You just don't think of growing as a person after you succeed, because what got you to that success was something that you already had in you, or you had some sort of advantage that ultimately led you to your success. You just don't need to grow if it's already working for you. In all my failures, I've learned critical lessons in life after those failures. It was never after my successes. Because when I'm at my most depressing and sad after a failure, that is when I make a commitment to myself that I will do better next time. I will learn and grow from that failure as a result. And I make that promise to myself. Because the humiliation, the shame, and embarrassment helps motivate me to become a better person. Because I don't want to experience that again. I have a negative reaction to feeling those feelings. And so when you're going through some type of failure, have in mind that growth comes afterwards. And those negative feelings can be used to harness and convert it into motivation to help you become a better person in the future. Number 4, connections matter, seek help. In most of my tips and suggestions, I've often talked about the benefits of seeking help and finding others to support you. This is also the case after a failure. Finding people to help console you after a failure is really critical. Others can help put your failure in perspective and help you have an emotional outlet. This is really emotionally freeing because you're putting all your emotional energy out there and they're just listening to you. And you're able to process that emotion as you're talking to them and maybe discover something of yourself. And you're just processing that emotion when you're communicating them, and that will help you to move past failure even faster. In most of my failures, I was very lucky to have an emotional support group around me. I relied on them heavily to help me get through my toughest times. And they were really the ones who support me and gave my failures some perspective. Because not all my failures were life-ending or were as dramatic as I made them out to be. So really, if you can, find a support group when you're going through a failure or rely on existing support groups to help you through. It can be key to moving past failure and onto the growth process. And number 5, don't lie to yourself. This is a big one. Don't lie to yourself when you failed. This is never a good thing to try to hide the truth from yourself. You need to know exactly why you failed and what led up to your failure. Whether or not it's out of your control or not, you need to know the truth behind everything that led up to it. The reason why it's so important is that if you actively start to shift yourself into blaming others or lying about why you failed, then it does nobody any good. Lying to yourself pushes the blame onto external factors. You stop growing from your failures as a result of this because it's really hard to take responsibilities from your own actions if you think someone else is the cause. In my early 20s, I did this nonstop. I blamed others for my problems, and that was never good. It wasn't until small multiple failures leading up to leaving San Francisco where I finally confronted my failures. It wasn't until I started to really do some hardcore self-reflection that I started to realize where my failures were coming from. And it was coming from many, many small lies that I told myself over the years that absolved me from the blame. I had to slowly take personal responsibility for all those things that I told myself in the past. And it was only then that I was able to start moving past it. And so I leave you with this. I know it's going to be hard. Putting failure in perspective, especially an unbiased perspective, is going to be challenging. Always try to keep in mind your involvement of why you failed. There are certain things that definitely were outside of your circumstances, but for the most part, there were things that you could do that you could have avoided failure. So thinking about those circumstances and what caused that failure can really help your growth process. And it gives you a template on how to avoid that exact failure in the future. So those are my tips on how to overcome and push through failure. Failure can be a painful experience, and there's no one magic bullet that can take care of it quickly. But if you're able to push through and move on past it, you can grow an incredible amount. And that experience you can take for the next time you're encountering a similar situation. In my life, I've had many times where failure was staring at my face, and I had to stare back at it to overcome the abyss. It was really tough to move past those times. And because I was able to slowly make progress on it and eventually rely on self-reflection, I was able to eventually move past it, or at least learn something from that experience. I've really gotten better in my confidence when going through a failure and my ability to bounce back quickly. I still go through the same process of recovery during a failure, but the tips I've learned over time has really helped me to shorten that length of time. So I really hope that this video helps you process through failure and eventually help you grow beyond it. So please leave me a comment down below on what you've learned from failure and how you would have done things differently now. And as always, take care and I'll see you next time.